All right, we're going to wrap things up here in chapter 4. Of course, we always come back to gender. One of the most fundamental changes in U.S. gender relations has been the increasing participation of women in the paid labor force. This is a change related to both demographic trends, like lower birth rates, and ultimately changing aspirations. It's amazing what you can get, ladies, when you got a job. If you can actually make money yourself and you do not have to rely on your male spouse, well, then you have the ability to control your destiny. Or, no, I'm sorry, not control your destiny. Destiny is already predetermined. To control your fate. My bad. Large-scale, macro-level forces have tended to raise the status of women and ultimately narrow the income gap. But it hasn't equalized gender relations. For example, although women and men are now equal in terms of education, women tend to get lower returns on their investments in human capital. The old 75 cents on the dollar. I think it may be 78 cents on the dollar. Once again, in reference to men and women, it's not that women's wages are increasing as much as it is male wages are decreasing. So we're all becoming more equal in our impoverished condition compared to the local, regional, national, and global elites. Another thing we have to talk about is modern institutional discrimination. This is a more subtle but still powerful form of discrimination that is often unintentional or unconscious and exists more in the results for minority groups than in the intentions or prejudice of dominant group members. For example, if you're hiring solely based on educational criteria, well, you're most likely going to hire more folks from the dominant class that has the opportunity to get those educational credentials. Another important characteristic is industrial flight. We've already talked about the loss of extractive and manufacturing opportunities in the United States, and it's just coming out in this case as well. And then, of course, standardized testing can be culturally biased, and individuals from certain groups are just going to do worse than the dominant is going to do on those exams because you're drawing predominantly on the dominant view of the world, if you will. Continuing this idea of modern institutional discrimination, we see past and present institutional discrimination, which involves practices in the present that have discriminatory consequences because of some pattern of discrimination or exclusion in the past. Seniority rules is a great example of this. It's much more difficult to identify, measure, and eliminate this more subtle form of institutional discrimination. And some of the most heated disputes in recent group relations have concerned public policy and law in this area. How do we move past this institutional form that still lingers even though our social norms and values might have changed? Institutions change slowly, folks. Among the most controversial issues are affirmative action and affirmative action programs that attempt to ameliorate the legacy of past discrimination, as in hiring practices or increase diversity in the workplace or in schools. So to compensate for some of these structural realities that tend to favor the dominant population, affirmative action is trying to right these wrongs. So I alluded to affirmative action earlier in the beginning of this lecture. Affirmative action was great for white males when they were the ones that got the jobs. It only becomes a problem when minority groups start to gain access to better paying jobs at the expense of a small percentage of the white dominant population that they begin to call foul. So since it is more subtle and indirect, this institutional discrimination is more difficult to identify and eliminate. So affirmative action programs, especially those that stress equality of opportunity, which include recent cases involving higher education, we're trying to address the wrongs. Therefore, the Supreme Court further narrowed the ability of universities to consider race in admission decisions. So even though we have used the courts to protect discriminated against populations, we are now starting to see the courts rethink affirmative action. I don't know if what they're saying is that, well, affirmative action has been available long enough that populations should have been able to gain some traction in upward mobility, or it's a different interpretation of the Constitution, or I'm not sure why, but or maybe the social norms and values are shifting back. But just because it's a law doesn't mean it's set in stone. It can change over time. And last but not least, although the opportunity to pursue favorable change was the result of broad structural changes in the American society, the realization of these opportunities came from the efforts of the many who gave their time, their voices, their resources, and sometimes their lives in pursuit of racial justice in America. So if you're looking at your society, folks, and you're seeing racial justice, you're seeing the opportunity to move, to have some upward mobility, albeit limited, and especially if you're a person of color and you see these things, it's because other people defended and struggled to attain those rights that you in turn could benefit from in the long run. Because those that stood on the front lines in the civil rights movement, ultimately, yes, they benefited, but it took a long time for them to see the benefits of their struggles. Whereas us today, in many respects, we look around and we're surprised when ideas of white supremacy or racial hate start to bubble up. Well, there was a time not too long ago, folks, that was the norm. Whether you lived in the South or the North, that was the norm. Racial superiority, black folks had their place, and they better stay in it. But that's not how it is today. At least we're moving further and further away from that reality. And ultimately, the struggles that African Americans make during the middle part of the 20th century benefits other groups in our society as well.